Hello, and welcome to our section on the presidency and the executive branch. I'm going to experiment here with some shorter videos interspersed with stuff from the web, so we'll see how this goes. We're going to start first with the presidency and then move on to the rest of the executive branch. So the presidency is sort of a unique topic in political science. Now, obviously, the activities of the president, the kinds of things that happen as a president is elected, and the policies that are worked through in each administration are clearly very, very important. But unlike lots of other parts of political science, there just aren't that many presidents to study, right? There's only 45 of them so far. And so the presidency as a topic of study tends to look more like a historical or a thematic kind of study when we're talking about administrations. Now, I'm talking about policy, it can look more like regular political science where we have more numbers and those sorts of things. But one of the challenges in studying the presidency is that among elected offices in the United States, it's entirely unique. It's the only office for which every voter votes, at least in the context of the Electoral College. And the president is supposed to serve as the primary representative of the people as a whole. And so we'll talk about that as we go along in terms of the roles that the president plays. But where we're going to start out now is we're going to talk about sort of the larger concept of the president in our political system, and then also we're going to talk about constitutional instruction. So one of the first things that we can always point to when we talk about a president is something that I think the best way to think about it is as an expectation gap between what we think the president can do and what is really possible. Now, some of that is not voters' fault, right? Some of that is about campaign promises, right? So often presidents presidential candidates make promises, particularly about the economy, about jobs, about prices and inflation. But the reality is that the president, on their own, have very little impact on the economy, right? The president has tools to help influence the economy, but right, so the president appoints people who are in charge of things like the Federal Reserve, but the president themselves doesn't make any policy specifically that is linked to the economy. So this is one of the challenges. It's also the case that because the president is the only elected official for whom everyone has voted one way or the other, we tend to be more sort of personally attached to our presidential candidates, and that sets up a pretty significant expectation gap. One of the ways that we can see this is something called the difference between the head of state and the head of government. So think about it this way. In most countries, even in most democratic countries, those roles are split apart. The head of state is the person who is sort of the embodiment of the country, of the people of that country, while the head of government is a politician who is helping to pass policy and moving an agenda forward and things like that. So think about Great Britain. In Great Britain, the head of state is the Queen, right? But the head of government is the Prime Minister. And so this expectation of what it means to be the embodiment of a nation, of a group of people, in some ways is easier for the Queen because she doesn't have to act one way or the other in terms of politics. So that gives some leeway in terms of like the Queen's speech on COVID-19. Now, granted, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, or of Great Britain, was in the hospital at the time, but you can see where those two things might be different. Well, in the United States, those two jobs are joined together. The president is both head of state and head of government. And so that can be a real challenge when a president is operating as, or trying to operate as a head of state, and yet takes all the baggage of being head of government with him. So think about it this way. If a president speaks at a time of national mourning, right, or a time of national celebration, most of us tend to view their comments through our partisan lenses, not through what's going on, right? So even when the president welcomes the, the winner of the NCAA national championship in some sport, right? Or the winners of the World Series, right? That's the part of the idea of being head of state. You get the president is celebrating the greatness of Americans, right? By inviting them to the White House, right? Well, but it's hard not to look at that invitation through the lens of politics. And you see that happening, not significantly with President Trump, but with previous presidents as well, athletes, people like that, declining invitations to the White House, not because they don't want to be seen as an embodiment of American greatness, but rather because they don't want to be seen next to a president whose policies they disagree with. So this is a challenge, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those roles that the president plays, but the expectation gap is actually quite large. And what we'll see later on is that when we look at presidential approval ratings, right, almost to a president, those things go down over time, right? Why? Well, the expectation gap is real, and people get disappointed with their presidents pretty easily. All right, so let's talk about the constitutional instructions concerning the president. Now, remember from our previous conversations, right, that the Constitution has more explicit instructions to give to Congress than any other branch, and the president in particular is a challenging kind of job for the framers to think about, because they'd never really had a model of an executive who was not a sovereign, not royal, not a king. Even the example of Great Britain, where there was at the time a prime minister, the king was still the enforcer of the laws, right? The king was still the one for whom justice revolved around. So we see it's less obvious in the Constitution, but in the early republic, there was a lot of controversy about, well, what does this thing called a president mean, right? What does it mean to have executive power? How do we protect the country from having an out of control executive, right? We don't want more tyranny. We don't want another king, even to the extent that we had quite a controversy over what to call the president, right? So John Adams, the first vice president, actually lobbied to have people call the president Your Excellency, and people decided, particularly members of Congress, decided that sounded too much like a king, and so that's why we simply call the president Mr. President, which sort of emphasizes the fact that they are part of this system from which they have been elected. Okay, so the Constitution lays out that the president is intended to be a representative of the nation as a whole, and it sets up the Electoral College. And we've had lots of conversations about the Electoral College, but remember the key point here is that it was intended to be a block against tyranny, but largely what it does is it simply reflects the states that a president has won. The Constitution, so basically all that it says is that the vice president should take over if the president becomes incapacitated. So what does that mean? Well, we don't know. We didn't know. In fact, it was not until the 25th Amendment, which was passed in the 1950s, did we have a clear set of guidelines for what incapacity meant, right? Because there were a number of times, the most obvious of which being the last year or so of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, when the president themselves was largely incapacitated. Wilson had had a stroke. And so, in fact, the sort of dirty secret was that his wife was basically running the cabinet and running the country behind the scenes while he was basically unaware of what was going on. So what the 25th Amendment did is it was intended to solidify the line of succession, who becomes president and under what contexts, right? So that means that it's not simply just about succession, it's about a whole variety of things, of what counts as incapacity and how do you judge that. And so there were times when, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, presidents have had to have surgery, right? So President George H.W. Bush had some heart surgery while he was president. President Reagan had to do some of this after he was shot, but basically there is provision in there to sort of hand the reins over to the vice president for a certain period of time while the president is under anesthesia, right? It also sets up a sort of, it also set up the limit of only 2.5 terms for each president. But so that's what's happening in the 25th Amendment. There's all these pieces, parts. So here's what the line of presidential succession is. So the vice president, and then the Speaker of the House, the president pro tempore of the Senate, and then the Secretary of State, and then the cabinet offices in the order that they were created. Now, generally speaking, we sort of look at this and say, okay, really, we have to be able to put that down all the way to Homeland Security. But there's a couple things to think about here. So one of them is that there's even a whole show on some network, I don't remember which one, called Designated Survivor, which is about the idea that during the State of the Union speech, for example, all of these people are in the same room. And so there has to be one person who is not there. And it's usually one member of the cabinet who is in a bunker in West Virginia to keep them away from the Capitol building that night, just in case someone would blow it up or somebody would have a problem. And that's actually part of what happened on September 11th, the last flight, Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania. We think that it was headed toward the Capitol building. And so after September 11th, there was actually quite a bit of work that was done behind the scenes to a continuity of control, not simply for the presidency, but for most of the executive branch. But this is the idea. This is all part of the constitutional instructions, even though this is part of the 25th Amendment. Clearly, the framers intended for there to be some kind of process in place to replace the president. Removal of the president. And so the Constitution lays out, both for the president and for all federal offices, the ability of impeachment. So impeachment, at least in the words of the Constitution, is linked to high crimes and misdemeanors, right? Bribery, several other kinds of explicit crimes. But it's meant to be a political trial or a political process, not a criminal and legal process. And, we just went through one of these. So this should be clearer in your minds than maybe in some other of the classes that I have taught. Now, the interesting thing is that the implications of the 25th Amendment and of the impeachment process is laid out in the Constitution, basically is how President Nixon resigned instead of being impeached and removed. And all the evidence suggests he would have been impeached and removed had he not resigned. The House was actually in the process of voting on articles of impeachment when he resigned. But because of the existence of the process in the 25th Amendment and the ability to declare incapacity, legal scholars said, yep, the president can do that, and President Ford was sworn in. So yes, and as you remember, there have been several impeachment cases. There was one in the 19th century, Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president of Abraham Lincoln and became president when Lincoln was assassinated. We sort of count Nixon in the impeachment list. Clinton was impeached and acquitted. Trump was impeached and acquitted. But the reality is that bringing articles of impeachment or introducing them into the House is not hard to do. It's just like introducing a regular bill. And so bills have been introduced to impeach Ronald Reagan, both Bushes, Obama at least once, right? So the idea of starting a move toward impeachment is not at all the same thing as getting enough people to vote for it. So that's the end of the constitutional instructions for president. And next we will move on to talk about the president's powers.